Steve Koukoulas here. Mark's feeling a little bit crook at the moment, unfortunately. Get well soon, Mark. You know, it's not great, but there seems to be a little bit of a comeback in some of this illness in the economy. You know, we thought we would sort of been getting over this COVID shock and the implications that had for jobs and the economy and business, but there's just a bit of a hint that it's coming back. So get well soon, Mark. RBA board meets next week. We've had in the last month, well, an interesting thing. So, to give us some credit, Mark and I were expecting the RBA to go 25 basis points in November. Lo and behold, they did. When we look at the reasons why they only went 25 instead of 50 that some people were talking about, and certainly central banks, the Federal Reserve, the Reserve Bank in New Zealand, they're slamming on 75-point rate hikes still. The RBA only went 25 because they're seeing signs of the economy cooling off, that they're seeing importantly that a lot of the reasons that cause this inflation problem that we've got, remember that the RBA does try to get that inflation rate in annual terms between 2 and 3%. It's currently at 7%. The reasons why that happened are now starting to reverse, and in no particular order, global economic growth is starting to slow down. We know the rate hikes in the US, in the Eurozone, in Canada, New Zealand. We're seeing global economic activity slow down. That is always the prerequisite for inflation coming back down. So that's one tick for the lower inflation climate. We'll look at the supply chain issues. Remember back in the middle of this year or the first half of this year, supply chain issues. We'd run out of the chips that went into car manufacturing and a whole lot of other things. Shipping container rates had gone from 1,500 US dollars for a 20-foot container to 10,000. They're back to 2,000. So that higher cost of doing business and just getting the imported items into the country has now slowed down. The delivery times have eased. So if you're wanting a car now, you don't have to wait 10 months. You still have to wait a little bit, but Toyota are now, for example, producing 23% more cars than they're budgeted for. So we're getting this supply chain issue. So the things that cause inflation to go up are now easing. Hasn't shown up in our inflation data yet. It will. And that's why the RBA only went 25 basis points in the past month. Also in the past month, well, we've had a range of really interesting indicators. Retail sales were weak in the month of October. They actually fell 0.2%, the first fall this year. So we consumers are reacting to the higher interest rates, the falling house prices, which is denting our wealth. We had CapEx, private sector business investment, a really important part of the economy, surprisingly fell 0.6% in the September quarter. Doesn't sound like a big fall, but we need the CapEx to go up, not down. And so when the RBA board meets next week, they'll be mulling over all of this, plus the fact that they've already delivered 275 points of rate hikes in this cycle. There's a lot in there, and they're going to be saying, do we really need to sort of slam more on to the sort of rate hiking cycle? The short answer is they probably will, but then they'll probably put in the words. So arguably what they say will be more important than what they do. And if they do the 25-point hike, for example, and then they say, look, we're going to take a pause. We reckon we've got a pipeline of a lot of rate hikes in there. We know there's a lagged effect from when we announce a rate hike to when it impacts on you and me, our borrowing, our spending, and as a business person, as consumers, there is a lag, and that lag can be anywhere from 3 to 12 months. So they're probably going to be signaling, yep, we're getting close to the top of the interest rate hiking cycle. A lot of retailers get about a third of their annual sales in a 6-week period, in about now until Christmas Day and even the post-Christmas sales. That's when they get about a third of their sales. So it's quite an important part. And this is where this lagged effect that I was talking about too. Remember the first rate hike was in May. Then we had one in June, July, every month since. So your point about now us consumers reacting to those earlier rate hikes is coming through. And while, look, I don't think people are completely running away from their spending and enjoyment of the festive season, the summer holidays and all these other things, there is clear evidence that we're tweaking back what we're spending and how much we're spending, that rather than necessarily really being flamboyant with our money. When interest rates were low, house prices were booming, we were spending like crazy. Retail sales earlier this year were rising at an annual rate around about 17%. Unbelievable. Now that we've got this pullback, I think that's going to continue. Consumer sentiment's still pretty weak. So when consumers are feeling gloomy, they tend to be a bit cautious with their spending. Oh, I better not spend. Oh, the energy bill's coming in. Yeah, the monthly payments have gone up another $100. So you're cautious in how much you spend. In fact, you're probably forced to scale back your spending, and that'll feed through into the slower economy. And then with another lag, us economists love lags, we're probably going to be starting to see that inflation rate coming down. That's the story for 2023. The RBA probably doesn't need to hike rates next week in December. They can probably afford to sit tight because they've got that pipeline of a bunch of rate hikes coming in. The global economy is slowing down. But they have this, I'll call it a mini dilemma. If they don't go, then there's a risk that the capital markets will think, oh, hang on, the RBA is not serious about getting inflation down because inflation is still very high. And the Fed, as we were saying before, the Fed's hiking like crazy in the US. The Reserve Bank in New Zealand, Bank of Canada, UK, they're all still hiking and hiking quite aggressively to show their anti-inflation credentials. The Reserve Bank don't want to be completely divorced from that party, if you so to speak. So they probably do deliver it. But the other thing you point out is also really important. While we're sort of saying, oh, the economy's slowing down, an economic slowdown does not, and I emphasize, not automatically equal a recession. It means we're slowing down. And the other thing that came out in the last couple of weeks, which again, Mark and I have been chatting about for several months now, is the health of the labour market. We saw that in the month of October, the October employment numbers, employment was solid. Unemployment, a fresh 48-year low, 3.4% unemployment rate. We've not seen that since 1974. And when you think about the jobs market, if you've got a job, you earn some money. You earn some money, you'll spend some of it. Or maybe turn it on its head. If you're unemployed, you earn nothing and you can't spend. So that actually is putting a floor under the economy, which is a good thing. And we should emphasize that. The other element of the labour market numbers that came out in the last few weeks was the wages side. And while they were not booming because the public service wages are being held back because a lot of state governments haven't been paying much of an increase to police and teachers and nurses and healthcare professionals and other sort of caring professions that the state governments look after. Private sector wages, including bonuses, so including sort of retention payments that a lot of people are actually getting paid now. So the base salary plus bonuses, broadly defined, actually rose at an annual rate of 4%. That's actually pretty good. So, here we are still saying the slowdown's coming, we've got to be careful, we've got to be cautious. And a lot of people are extrapolating the slowdown into a hard landing, as you touched on, the R word recession. Unlikely, because I think we've got a degree of health still in the labour market. And while people have a job and while they're getting a slight increase in their rates of pay, it puts a floor under the economy, which reduces the risk of recession in 2023. Australia doesn't have one housing market. What happens in Perth in terms of house prices, for example, is very different to what happens in Hobart, to Sydney, Brisbane, regional areas, which of course have become increasingly popular during the COVID lockdowns that we had a year or two back. What we've been seeing since the start of the rate hiking cycle in May, Sydney prices have been hit hardest. They were the highest. So in a sense, you could sort of understand why with rate hikes and the economy now starting to slow, you'd see Sydney weaken most. It had the higher you go, the larger you fall sort of thing. They're down about 11% approximately according to the CoreLogic numbers. Melbourne's slowing, but the rate of decline is actually moderating. In fact, the numbers that came out, they had a big hit early on in the year, and now the rate of decline is actually fairly moderate. Brisbane, which was an absolutely gangbusters booming market for a couple of years, is actually now caught up to Melbourne. It's down about 7% odd. So Brisbane's coming off the boil too quite rapidly, and all that influx of people, which helped fuel the Brisbane Gold Coast, Southeast Queensland price boom, is now moderating. And the really fascinating thing when I look at the city by city regional house prices, since the first rate hike, Adelaide and Perth and Brisbane house prices are higher today than they were when the first rate hike was delivered by the RBA in May. So Sydney is minus 11% in terms of house prices from the start of the rate hiking cycle. Adelaide's plus 3% or thereabouts. Other factors than plain old interest rates are having an impact. And as we said, it probably was because Sydney had that incredibly high price. The median house price, $1 million something dollars, is extraordinary. Adelaide's relatively affordable, as is Perth, and Perth is still benefiting from, what's still a pretty buoyant mining sector. So I think all the remember that also WA had a very strict border lockdown in the low point of the COVID disaster. They've opened up the border, so a lot of people are flocking back in, adding to a bit of a demand there. So very different demographic factors can have an impact on house prices too. So that said, I think that with the broad picture on housing, there's probably a bit more of a weakness to come. It doesn't stop on a dime. The house prices, when they do fall, they tend to fall for about a year. Now we've had, what, 7, 8 months of decline. So there's probably a few more months of decline to come. No doubt about that. But in the early months of 2023, I'm thinking that with the recent government announcement of a big increase in immigration, 235,000 net migration, 195 of those skilled workers, and by definition, skilled workers, they got a money, they get a job, and we've got a really tight labour market, as we were saying a moment ago. They're going to want to certainly rent in the first instance, but then possibly buy. But even the rental market's so tight that sort of spills over into the investor market, perhaps coming back earlier than the owner occupier market rebounding. So population growth is going to be a really important part of that equation. And if we are in the early months of next year, and it's increasingly clear that the RBA is on hold, doesn't mean they're going to cut. And the fear, it's not just necessarily the level of interest rates, it's whether they keep moving. So people might be able to put this new interest rate into their mortgage calculator, 5.5, whatever the rate happens to be. And if there's an increasingly confident position that they're not going to go to 6 and 7, then people say, look, I can afford that. And they'll slowly move back into the market. The other thing that's been happening in the last month or two is that the auction clearance rates have no longer declined. Now, the volume of sales is relatively low each week, but if you look at the auction clearance rates that come through in, again, the big cities, Sydney and Melbourne, where they're predominantly auction sales, the auction clearance rates have been pretty good. They've been in the 60s. I think Sydney last week was actually 69%. So you had that. People are buying. So perhaps the sellers, the vendors, are sort of thinking, okay, given that my house has gone up so much, I'm happy to take a little bit of a haircut. I'm happy to drop 10%. I thought my house was worth X minus 10%. It's still way more than it was 3, 5, let alone 10 years ago. And if you're selling for reasons of, you're upgrading, downgrading, tree change, sea change, whatever, and you're coming from Sydney, you can buy elsewhere in Australia pretty comfortably and have a fair whack of cash left over. So I think that dynamic, in terms of not just demographics with population growth and these sorts of things, but the dynamic on where people want to live, working from home, people sort of cashing out what's still been a fantastic investment, is perhaps playing out too. Yeah, energy, it's a pretty big ticket item that we all pay. Our electricity bill, gas bill come in once a quarter usually, sometimes once a month, but and the price is going up and it still hasn't fully gone up yet. There's still a bit of a shock to our power bills when we get them in the new year. We'll think, oh my goodness, did I really spend that much money on electricity? So there's still that shock to come in, and that cost of living pressure more generally, and that's an essential. If you're still spending money on essentials, so your rent, your mortgage repayments, your energy costs, fruit and veggie prices, these sorts of things have gone up a lot. The floods that are going to impact a lot of market gardens and the veggie prices there too. You might think, we're not going to sort of talk about that, but it does impact on your ability to have spare cash, if you like, or additional borrowing capacity when you're looking to buy a house. So these sort of things will be in the backdrop of people's minds, I dare say. But the issue that's going to be unfolding, as we we're discussing, if inflation does start to turn down, if the government, who I know is grappling with this issue of the energy costs, what are they going to do? They're going to put on a profits tax and sort of subsidise, our power bills. There's some talk in Canberra that they're looking at some sort of solution. It might come, relatively quickly. It might have already happened by the time people are listening to this podcast. They're wanting to do it before Christmas, I think, to get the announcement out there, because and to be fair, it's a really tough decision. You can't really win whatever you do. You've got to put on a tax, or you've got to do a subsidy, or you've got to cap exports of gas and coal, and there's a problem with the state government. So it's a really messy thing. But just because it's messy doesn't mean you don't do it. They've got to do something. and it won't be perfect, but it might just cap these energy prices. That's an important thing to look at. And if they do it reasonably well, I think some of that fear that we've got and some of the reasons why consumer sentiment's so gloomy, the cost of living, will be moderated a little. It's a quiet period after the RBA board meeting in early December. They don't meet in January. Hopefully the RBA members have had a torrid year. They're sunning themselves at the beach too. So hopefully they have a bit of a break too. However, and I think, and that's fine. We still get a run of economic data. The Bureau of Stats still produce their data. CoreLogic still produce their house price data. And so we'll still be looking at the economy. And again, the anecdotes from retailers. How was Christmas? Did people spend up or did they hunker down a little bit, will be a really important anecdote, which will show up eventually in the hard data. But nonetheless, that'll be an interesting thing. I think the focus after we get through this RBA board meeting will be on global conditions. That is really important to Australia. One of the things that I do, and Mark and I have chatted about this, I think on every podcast we've done, is what's happening to the global economy. Wake up every morning. What's the US economy done? What's the US stock market done? The bond market? What's the Fed done with interest rates? Let alone what's happening in China with its COVID lockdowns, which, and I've got no idea what they're doing, but are they easing some of the restrictions? Because they're smashing their economy in doing that, which is okay. So I'm not going to even pass judgment on that. But if they do relax some of their lockdown restrictions and the economy opens up a bit more, that's good news for the economy because it means China's growing. And if China grows, it's great for Australia. A third of our exports go to China. So I think in that late December and then through January before the RBA meets in February, gosh, we're throwing forward a long way here, we'll be looking at the global economy. What's the Fed going to do with interest rates? They have their next decision in the middle of December. What's happening to their economy? Are they getting a change in unemployment up, not down? There's some indicators there that the US economy is, really slowing and slowing abruptly. And if we get through to sort of late January and we find that the US economy's sort of stalled, has big implications for us here. So I think it'll be global watch. And then in late January, before the RBA gets back into the full swing of producing data and getting ready for their February board meeting, we'll have a complete stock take on where are we. And by then too, don't forget, we'll have a lot more domestic information about whether these rate hikes that started in May are impacting on us, on the economy, on housing, on consumer spending, and on business investment as well. And don't forget, the RBA meets more frequently than most other central banks. The RBA meet every month except for January, so 11 meetings a year. For example, the US Federal Reserve only meets 8 times a year. Now, it doesn't sound like a big difference, but in a sense, when you add up all of the effects of meeting all the time, and the economy hasn't changed much. Do we still have to hike? Yes, no, yes. So you have this sort of debate going on. So a self-imposed pause, that pause in January is actually a pretty good thing, and it allows for the next bouts of retail sales data. The quarterly inflation numbers come out in late January for the December quarter, which will include these energy prices. That'll be an absolutely vital issue for early 2023. We're going to be having a look at the infamous, the Koukoulas monetary policy checklist, which Mark and I reintroduced a couple of months ago. And the feedback we've had already is that it's actually a really nice way of looking at the economy rather than just us talking, which is great too. But the checklist that we've got on this whiteboard here, if you could sort of move the pieces for me. And just to reiterate, what we've got down that left-hand column is a range of economic indicators: GDP, inflation, labour market. So we've spoken about them. And then we've got 3 columns. Does each of those indicators indicate a tightening in interest rates, going up, or they're neutral, RBA leaves rates on hold, or in some instances, are they sort of screaming out that the RBA needs to ease, cut interest rates? So first one, GDP. I'd put that in the neutral column because we do know that GDP growth is starting to cool off. It's not bad, but it is slowing down from that earlier momentum. Inflation, clearly tightening. Inflation's way above the target range. And while there's a hint of optimism that it's topping out, that's only a forecast. So looking at the hard data on the inflation rate, you'd say RBA still has to hike. On the labour market, as we've just discussed, tightening, no doubt, 3.4% unemployment rate, participation rate going up. It's incredibly low. So we've got that scenario, and linked to that one on wages, I'd put that in neutral. And as we were just discussing, there is evidence that wage momentum is starting to lift, but it's not at a level yet that would cause you that wage price spiral. When inflation's at 7%, wages, even at 3.5%, it's pretty simple, the equation. We are having to confront a 7% increase in our cost of living, energy, petrol, insurance premiums, the whole gamut of stuff that we spend our money on, and our wages are only going up at 3 or 3.5%. Something's got to give, and that's got to give is we spend less. We cut back on what I term nice to do things. Some of the things are essential. You can't cut spending on a whole bunch of stuff, but you can cut back on eating out, international holiday travel, and these sorts of things, unfortunately. And we're seeing evidence of that already, that people are sort of scaling back on things that aren't absolutely essential, or they're redirecting. Instead of having a nice holiday to Bali or Greece or somewhere, maybe you just have a holiday down at Bateman's Bay and Malua or somewhere, which is still really nice, don't get me wrong. Anyway, so that's an important thing. International economy, I'm going to put into the easing side. That's one of the checklist indicators that has the economy slowing down, as we discussed. US slowing markedly, at risk of recession. Europe, China, and as we hear now, China hasn't ended its lockdowns. Chinese economy is slowing, so I'd put that in the easing case. It would be nice to think that in the not too distant future, China says, look, Australia, you're being a much more constructive global citizen, and towards us in particular, the Chinese, so we'll let them ease. So that's a good thing. But that said, the international economy is still slowing down. House prices. Well, I'd put them I'd put them in between neutral and easing. So they're not quite easing yet. So next one across on an easing, because they're, as we just discussed, down 7% from the peak, still trending lower and not a problem. So they're not unambiguously in easing. So, and again, I think the RBA would be content after that 25% increase, in the 18 months up to early this year. 7% down, we can live with that. But if it starts to get to double-digit price falls, the wealth effect starts to become a little bit more problematic. Retail sales, I'm going to put them into the neutral side because, as we said, the last couple of months have shown a pullback in retail spending. Again, a desirable thing. So we're not quite yet into the easing side for retail sales. Another 2 or 3 months, particularly as we were just discussing over that Christmas period, we see us consumers scaling back retail sales even more. I'd move that into easing. But for here and now, it's a welcome slowdown. Consumer sentiment, that's easing. We are gloomy. The Westpac measure, ANZ also produced a measure of consumer sentiment. They're at levels consistent with recession. So we are feeling really gloomy right now, partly because cost of living, house prices turning down. These are the sort of things that make us feel, just uncertain about things. Building approvals, I'm going to put them in the neutral side because they have come off the boil. They are slowing down. But again, there's a bit of a distortion, remembering that in the COVID recession, state and federal governments had a lot of building support measures. So there was a bring forward of construction activity. Yes, it's slowed down, but it's not a problem just yet. And of course, there's a lot of constraints on supply chain issues still in building, and labour market issues. Hard to get a tradie to put in a screw and hammer in a nail or whatever tradies do. I'm not a tradie. Business investment, I'm going to put neutral too. We said that the September quarter numbers were disappointing. They were. But business is still reasonably optimistic. If you look at the sentiment numbers for business, unlike consumers who are gloomy, business is upbeat, but that doesn't demand a rate hike. So that's where the business confidence is also in the neutral column too. So we'll whack that one across. Commodity prices, I'm going to put that in neutral as well. So we're getting a lot of neutrals because commodity prices have come down from the highs. You're noticing that probably on your petrol costs. That's a high-profile commodity price. But things like iron ore, copper, tin, wheat and wool, the things that we don't use every day or buy directly, but they do feed into stuff that we buy, manufactured goods and food stuffs and these sorts of things. They've come off the boil, and if they even stay where they are, they'll have a disinflationary impact, so they don't matter for the RBA. Stock market, I'm going to be boring, neutral, because the stock market is grinding higher, yes, and that sentiment change. As soon as we've started to see that evidence that US inflation is cooling off. And some of these indicators that we've mentioned, the stock market gets a sigh of relief. They are quicker than you and me to respond to news on lower inflation. Bang! You see these, you wake up every morning. Oh, the Dow's up 700 points. Wow! So they're reacting very quickly to that. So it was weaker a couple of months ago. So that rebound in the last couple of months is encouraging. But neither here nor there. Current interest rates, I'm going to put that in the neutral column as well. That they're 2.85, probably a 25-point move next week from the RBA. They're neither really crunching the economy, while some people are being crunched. It's not crunching the macro economy, nor are they providing that stimulus. So the RBA's moved rates from what was very stimulatory to now easing. So we look at the checklist, and just by the way, not every item has an equal weighting. I want to emphasize that. So, for example, inflation and the labour market are very, very important indicators. And so the top end's way more important than arguably the bottom end. And you can see there that the inflation and labour market are in the tightening column. But if you look at what's in the easing column, the international economy, important. Consumer sentiment, sort of important. The weight of inflation and labour market alone, say RBA hikes next week. But with so many things moving from what was a tightening bias to the neutral column, that says to me that when we get to February and we do our podcast for the February board meeting, there might be one or two that have gone from neutral into the easing side. The thing to remember, rate hikes work. It's not, economics can be really, really simple sometimes. When the Reserve Bank put interest rates down, like they did during the COVID lockdowns and all the rest of it, we thought, great, my cost of borrowing is really low. I'm going to go out and borrow a truckload of money and I'm going to spend, which we did. And now we've got the opposite of that, interest rates going up. We think, oh, gee, my cost of servicing my mortgage has gone up or my business loan. I'm going to hunker down, and that you get this shift. So this checklist should move, maybe not every month, every item moves, but every quarter. You would expect to see some of these discs moving, different ways across the board. And when you get a whole lot of them in one column, that's what the RBA is going to do. So, for example, just as one final wrap-up point on the good old checklist, if we get in the next couple of months, I won't pinpoint a month, but in the next couple of months, if we do actually find that the labour market starts to soften, that we get the unemployment rate ticking up, because, by the way, we've got job ads that have turned down a bit, and the economy's slowing down. So you'd expect the labour market to weaken. But if in the next few months we get the unemployment rate going from, say, 3.4 to, say, 3.7, 3.8%, not a bad result, but you'd probably have the monetary policy implication. Remember, this is what the RBA's, will they hike or will they cut or will they keep them the same? That disc will move to neutral. Or if we get, for example, business investment booming, businesses say, yep, we want to really ramp up our capital expenditure, you'd actually move that into the tightening column. Or, so you can sort of think of scenarios where these discs move. But what is the important thing about this is not so much a forecast, it's what has actually happened to these various economic indicators. A very fruitful discussion, I dare say, from the board members at the RBA. Bottom line, they do hike again. They do probably go 25 basis points to 3.1% for the official cash rate. But the debate from some of the more dovish members, the ones that are less aggressive on the rate hiking cycle, might be, hey, look at some of these indicators. They might be flagging the international economy. They might be flagging the fact that, current rates are already getting towards that sort of less easy, more neutral, more restrictive level. So the debate will be hot, but bottom line, 25 from the RBA on Tuesday. For a recession to occur, you need lots of parts of the economy to go backwards. The only thing that's probably going to go backwards in the near term is housing construction activity, because of that pipeline of the slowing in building approvals. Business investment, while business investment disappointed in the September quarter, as we mentioned, the outlook's still positive. So you're going to get business investment with a plus sign in terms of its contribution to GDP in 2023. Firms shelved a lot of projects during the lockdowns. Firms know now that they need to ramp up their IT spending. They postponed it. Or building warehouses and factories. The government's actually ramping up a lot of its manufacturing incentive and support. Now, not huge in itself, but to get a recession, that stuff doesn't happen. And the other thing about us consumers, it's a slower rate of growth. Remember, a recession is the economy going backwards. Will slow down because business investment's okay, consumer spending will still be positive, but quite weak. It'll still be weak, but it won't be negative. And so the talk of recession, low probability, and the important thing to remember, the RBA, who have made some mistakes in this last year, as everybody who's been watching and reading this issue, the RBA has made some mistakes. Yes, the RBA governor apologised for his guidance, his bad guidance, when he said rates on hold till 2024. My goodness, we all make mistakes, but Dr. Lowe, that was a shocker. Um, the interesting thing here and now is that he doesn't, as the RBA governor, want his fingerprints on a recession in Australia. He doesn't want to be, say, in 6 months' time or 12 months' time, people sort of saying, mate, why did you keep hiking interest rates aggressively when it was obvious the international economy was turning down, when it was obvious commodity prices were turning down, when we knew house prices were turning down? Why did you keep hiking? He doesn't want to have his fingerprints on a recession that comes from that, which is why already, as we were discussing earlier, they've only gone 25 and 25 in the last two meetings, and why they may only go 25 this time around. I'd like to look at 2023 in two halves, actually. I think the first half of 2023 will be weak. The rate hikes that are being delivered, problems in Ukraine, energy prices impacting Europe particularly, will drag the world economy into a really weak period. Whether it's a recession, in a way, it doesn't matter what label we put on, it'll be weak economic activity. I also think that by, gosh, without pinpointing a month, March, April, May-ish, no, central banks, including the Federal, realise, hey, we've done more than enough to get inflation lower. That these early indicators that we're seeing that inflation's starting to taper down a little bit will probably come through in the hard inflation data, and they'll say, oh, we don't need to do as much. And it's absolutely fascinating to look at the money market interest rates in the US, not so much here in Australia, but in the US. They do have more rate hikes priced in. Yep, we'll see a few more from the Fed. But after a peak in US official interest rates in around about June 2023, they've got rate cuts priced into the latter part of 2023 and certainly into 2024. So, in 6 months' time, we could actually be having this sort of discussion. Central banks have achieved the slowdown. Inflation is cooling off. And hey, we do have too much monetary tightness in the system, and we've got to take some of that away with, a couple of gentle interest rate cuts. That'll be the fascinating sort of left field issue, in my view, for 2023. One of the things that I've learned over many years, and Mark and I have had this conversation many times over, gosh, 2 decades or so, we've known each other for a long time, is that when housing turns up, not so much when it slows down, but when it turns up, it's a shock. Wow, I didn't realize that it turned so quickly, is sort of the thing that we discover after the event. Now, I'm not saying, rush out and buy a house. No, it depends on a whole bunch of your personal indicators. But, we've already had, as we said, the house prices have turned down a fair bit already. And if that increase in population, the tightness in the rental market, the solid performance of the labour market all of a sudden inspire people saying, well, hang on, that house that I saw a year ago in Sydney is now 10, 12, 15% cheaper. Yeah, interest rates have gone up, but I've got a good job. I've got a pay rise. I'm going to buy it. It's 10% cheaper than it was. And in Sydney, that's a chunk of cash. That is a huge chunk of cash. So even on a, what I think median price is about 1.2 million in Sydney, depending on who you look at. If prices are down 10, 15%, you're saving 150 grand. And yes, sure, interest rates are up, no question. But I'm wondering whether that, what do we call it, bottom picking or bottom fishing for that low point. Bargain hunting might be the terminology. And if you see that house and, for some sellers, we haven't seen it yet, there might be the odd distressed sale that comes through. And if you're a buyer, you might be able to swoop and get a bargain. I'm not suggesting that, but as I said, one thing that would be a left field view for 2023 is that this time next year we'll be saying, oh, gee, that house price weakness was a fair way away. And house prices, not that they're going to boom, but they'll find a low point and they might just start to grind a little bit higher through the second half of 2023. How's this for a recent example? The COVID lockdowns. Remember at the beginning of 2020, when we weren't happening, everyone, myself included, was forecasting a slump in house prices because unemployment was going up. And that's even with zero interest rates, or official interest rates. Well, oh, the economy's going to be disastrous. House prices are going to be miserable, rotten. And then all of a sudden we realized they were up 5%, up 10, 15, 20%. Where did that come from? No immigration. Remember, the borders were shut, So where did we get that 20%, 25% increase in house prices during COVID? So I'm not saying that we're going to get 25% increase, now, now that we've had this bit of a correction in house prices, but if you find the right house, if you've got your money approved and all these other important things, there could well be a few bargains. And I know a few family, friends, and contacts who are sort of in the market. Then they're sort of overseeing the whole housing market, looking for that bargain to come through. Because, as we said, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, prices down 7, 8, 9, 10, 12%. That's a whole lot cheaper than they were a year ago. And when we get to February, look, if I was to put my hand on my heart and say, "Hey, what's my forecast for interest rates in the first half of 2023?" I'll say they'll be on hold. I think we'll get more and more of the commentary coming through. And I know a couple of the banks in recent times, I don't want to paraphrase them because I haven't seen their updated forecasts, but I know CBA, for example, is starting to say, hey, we're after December, we'll be at the peak in the interest rate cycle. And if more in the financial community are recognizing that, and of course, CBA with a huge mortgage book, they're not saying this for fun. They're trying to forecast where things are going. If that becomes a more common theme, then we'll get into the first half of 2023, rates on hold. The fear of rates skyrocketing rather than just moving higher will be gone. And maybe the sentiment towards housing will change and change relatively quickly.